Walter James Odom had been a grandfather for 7 years. He had been a teacher before that. He had been a principal before he retired. He had been a husband for 41 years. He had been a son for 67. But grandfather was the word that had arrived last, and it was the word that had most completely reorganized everything that came before it. He had not expected that. He had expected to love Cora. He had not expected the reorganization. His mother, Dorothy, had worked in the cafeteria at Carver Street Elementary for 22 years. She had cooked for other people's children before she cooked for her own. She had learned from this. She had told Walter when he was 8 years old, every child in that building is the most important thing in some person's life. You remember that when you look at them. You do not look at a child and see a problem. You look at a child and see what someone has poured everything into. He had remembered it. He had remembered it for 59 years. He had remembered it every morning when he walked the halls of Roosevelt Elementary as principal and looked into classrooms and saw children bent over their work. His father, James Odom Sr., had worked at the Riverside printing press for 28 years. He ran the large format machine on the second floor. He wore the same gray work shirt every day. He had 3 of them. He called them his uniforms. He said a man who takes his work seriously wears a uniform. It does not matter what the work is. The uniform says, I am here for this. I am not here for anything else. Walter had taken this seriously. He had worn a tie every day of his 31 years in education, 8 as a classroom teacher, 23 as principal. Not because the dress code required it, because the tie was his uniform. It said, I am here for this. He had retired from Roosevelt Elementary in 2018. He had been principal since 1995. In those 23 years, he had overseen 4 building renovations, 8 curriculum overhauls, the hiring of 61 teachers, and the graduation to middle school of approximately 4,600 students. He knew the exact number. He had kept a count. Every June, when the 6th graders walked out the front door for the last time as Roosevelt students, he stood on the front steps and watched. He counted. He did not make a ceremony of the counting. He did it quietly. It was for him. He needed to know the number. He needed to know the weight of what had passed through. His first year as principal, he had inherited a building in which 3 of the 7 bathrooms did not lock, and the cafeteria had a leaking ceiling repaired with plastic sheeting, and 2 teachers had not spoken to each other in 4 years. He had fixed the bathrooms in March. He had fixed the ceiling in April. He had met with the 2 teachers separately. He had asked each of them what would it take. Neither of them had expected that question. The first teacher said, I do not know. He said, think about it. Come back Thursday. She came back Thursday. She had an answer. The second teacher said, I honestly do not think anything can be done. He said, I hear you. I am going to keep asking until one of us changes our mind. By June, they were not friends. By the following September, they were colleagues in the functional sense they covered each other's classes. They shared materials. They attended the same professional development sessions without incident. That was sufficient. He did not require friendship. He required a school in which children could learn. He had kept notebooks since his first year of teaching. Brown covers, wide-ruled, 1 per semester, roughly depending on how much happened. In each notebook, the names of students he was watching, the conversations he needed to follow up on the decisions he had made, and why the things he had done wrong, and what he would do differently. The things he had done wrong were not a short list. He had included them without shame. A record that only contains the things you got right is not a record. It is a monument. He was not interested in monuments. He was interested in accuracy. By the time he retired in 2018, there were 46 notebooks on the shelf in his study on Carver Street. On his last day, when the teachers and staff had gathered in the gymnasium for the retirement assembly, and the children had sung and the parents had brought food, and Renee had sat in the second row with her hand on Thomas's arm, Walter had stood at the microphone and said, I want to tell you what I have learned. He had paused. He had looked at the gymnasium. He had said the work is not the building. The work is not the curriculum or the test scores or the renovations. The work is the moment when a child decides they are going to keep going. You may or may not see that moment. You may or may not have been part of creating it. Your job is to be present in case it happens. That is the whole job. Stay present. He had said, "I have been present in this building for 23 years. I intend to remain present wherever I am." He had looked at the 46 notebooks waiting on the shelf at home. He had thought the 47th will have different names, but the same subject. That was where Cora came in, his wife, Margaret Renee Williams, Margaret Elaine Williams. Odom had been a social worker for 30 years. She had worked with families in the Riverside District and the Millbrook County area. She knew every child welfare office in 3 counties. She knew most of the judges. She knew what the paperwork looked like when a family was in trouble and what it looked like when they were on their way back. She had taught Walter the difference between urgency and panic. She had said early in their marriage when he came home distressed about a student, urgency means you act. Panic means you cannot act. Choose urgency. He had chosen urgency for 41 years. He chose it again on a Saturday in April. Their daughter Renee had been born in 1987. She was their only child. She had been a fierce and organized child who had grown into a fierce and organized woman. She worked in urban planning for the city of Riverside. She was 38 years old. She had married Thomas Achebe in 2012. Thomas was a civil engineer from a family that had come from eastern Nigeria 2 generations before. He was 40 years old. He was precise in his speech and large in his laughter. He liked to cook on Sunday afternoons and left the kitchen very clean after. Walter liked him completely. Cora Elaine Achebe had been born on March 7, 2017. She was named for her grandmothers. Cora for Margaret, whose middle name was Elaine, they had reversed it. She arrived 7 pounds 4 ounces. She had Thomas's complexion and Renee's eyes, and a mouth that belonged to no one's photograph but was entirely her own. Walter had been in the waiting room at Riverside General when she was born. He had been sitting there for 6 hours. Margaret was beside him. She had a crossword puzzle. She did 3 of them. He could not focus on anything. He stood up and sat down 11 times. Margaret did not tell him to stop. She understood. When Renee came out and said she is here, come see her. Walter walked down the hall and into the room and saw the small person in the blanket, and something in him shifted that had not shifted in 60 years. He had loved people before. He had loved Margaret for 41 years. He had loved Renee since the moment she arrived. He had loved his students in the particular way a principal loves students as a category and as individuals simultaneously. This was different. He could not explain how. He stood there looking at Cora for 6 minutes, and Margaret took a photograph, and he did not notice. Cora had learned to walk at 11 months. She had learned to talk in full sentences at 20 months. By the time she was 2, she was having opinions about things. Specific opinions about what she wanted for breakfast, about which books she wanted read and in which order, about the color of her shoes. She had started calling Walter Papa when she was 2 years and 4 months old. Not Grandpa, not Granddad, not any of the names he had heard grandchildren use. Papa. She said it the first time in the back seat of his car on a Tuesday morning when he was driving her to Renee's mother-in-law's house. She had been looking out the window. She said, Papa. Just that. Not as a question. Not asking for anything. Just the word. An announcement. He had looked at her in the rearview mirror. He said yes. She looked at him. She went back to looking out the window. He did not tell Margaret about this for 3 days because he needed to hold it by himself for a while. When he told her, she said, of course she did. She is going to know exactly who you are. She has already decided. His own children. Renee had called him Dad. He was Dad. He was glad to be Dad. But Papa was Cora's word. She had chosen it. He had not asked her to. He had not suggested it. She had arrived at it herself. He did not know what process had produced it in her 2-year-old mind, and he did not need to know. He only needed to know that she had chosen it. And she had. Every Saturday for 4 years she had said it the same way. Papa. Not as a question, as a statement of fact. The Saturday ritual had started when Cora was 3. Walter picked her up at 9 in the morning. He brought her back at 4 in the afternoon. 7 hours. They went wherever she wanted to go. In the first year of the ritual, the library every week without exception. She had a library card in her own name. The librarian, a man named Gerald Watts, who had worked the children's section for 18 years, knew her by sight. He had set aside a book for her the 3rd time she came in. He had said, "I thought you might like this one." She had taken it very seriously. She had read it that afternoon in the library chair and returned it when she was done and said, "I did like it." That had been sufficient. Gerald had nodded and gone to find the second book in the series. In the second year, they added the park and sometimes the botanical garden. Once she had stood in front of a particular pale pink rose for 9 minutes without moving. Walter had stood beside her. He did not say anything. He had learned from 31 years of education and 41 years of marriage when to talk and when to stand. This was a standing moment. She was doing something with the rose that did not require his voice. She was looking. She was the kind of child who looked at things completely before she moved on. When she finally turned away from the rose, she said, "It smells like what I think Sunday smells like." He said, "What does Sunday smell like?" She said, "Warm and old, but good old." He said, "Yes." He wrote it in the notebook that evening. In the 3rd year, she took a pottery class at the Community Arts Center every other week. She was very focused in the pottery class. She came out each time with clay on her forearms that she did not want washed off immediately. She said, "I am still thinking about it." She meant the piece. She meant the thing she had been working on in the clay. She needed to stay in proximity to the feeling of it before the day moved on. He always drove home the long way on pottery days. She sat in the back seat with her clay-marked arms looking out the window. He drove. That was the arrangement. She was also in the 3rd year becoming very serious about the grocery store. She squeezed things. She explained why she was squeezing them. She had opinions about peaches specifically. Walter had learned more about peaches from Cora than he had learned in 67 years of buying them. The Saturday in April was the Saturday of Cora's first dance recital. She had been studying with Ms. Patricia Bourne at the Riverside Community Arts Center since the previous September. 7 months. She practiced at home in the hallway, which was the longest clear space in the apartment. Renee had watched her practice so many times that she had learned the sequence herself. She had performed it once for Walter in the kitchen on a Thursday night with a dish towel in her hand. It was very accurate. He had told her, "You could perform this yourself." She had said, "I know. I know the whole thing." The recital was at 2 in the afternoon. Walter had picked up Cora at 9. They went to the park first because she wanted to see if the ducks were back on the East Pond. They were, 3 of them. Cora named them Howard, Patricia, and Clarence. She did not explain the names. Walter did not ask. At 10:15, they got back in the car. The recital was at 2. They had time. Cora said she wanted to get flowers for Ms. Bourne. Walter said of course. She said yellow ones. She said Ms. Bourne likes yellow. She said this with the certainty of someone who had verified it. Walter did not ask how she knew. He drove to the Westfield Grocery on Cedar Street. He parked in the lot at 10:38. He unstrapped Cora from her car seat. She was wearing her dance clothes under a navy jacket, pink leotard, white tights, her hair in the bun that Margaret had spent 25 minutes constructing that morning. She was carrying her small bag with her dance shoes inside. She took Walter's hand in the parking lot automatically. She had been taking his hand in parking lots since she was old enough to understand that parking lots required hand-holding. This was a rule she had absorbed and never questioned. They went inside. They found the flowers. Cora chose a bunch of yellow tulips and one white flower she called a moonflower, which Walter was fairly certain was a ranunculus, but he did not correct her. She carried them to the checkout. She put them on the conveyor belt carefully. She did not crush the pedals. She watched to make sure they were scanned gently. The cashier, a young woman named Tia, said, "Those are beautiful." Cora said, "They're for my dance teacher." Tia said, "She's going to love them." Cora said, "I know." They walked back to the car at 10:47. Walter opened the back door. He was getting the car seat strap arranged. Cora was on the seat holding the flowers, telling him where the recital would be and how many other dancers were in her group. She said, 8 of us. She said, "I am second from the left in the opening and third from the right in the finale." She had these positions memorized. She said them the way a navigator states coordinates. She was 7 years old. Walter was reaching across her to secure the strap when he heard the voice. "Sir," he straightened. He turned. An officer was walking across the lot toward him. Young, late 20s. He had parked his patrol car at an angle behind Walter's car. He said, "Sir, I need you to step away from the vehicle." Walter stepped back. He said, "Good morning. Is something wrong?" The officer said, "We received a report of a man matching your description in this parking lot." The report described a child in distress. Walter said, "This is my granddaughter, Cora. We have been at this grocery store buying flowers. We are going to her dance recital this afternoon." The officer said, "Sir, can you tell me what your relationship is to this child?" Walter said, "She is my granddaughter. My name is Walter Odom. My daughter is Renee Achebe. Cora is Renee's daughter." The officer said, "Do you have documentation?" Walter said, "I have my driver's license." He took it from his wallet and handed it. He said, "I can give you my daughter's phone number. She can confirm everything I am telling you." The officer looked at the license. He looked at Walter. He looked at Cora in the back seat. Cora was sitting very still, holding the yellow tulips. She was looking at the officer. She said, "Papa." It was the same tone, the announcement tone, not frightened, stating a fact. The officer said, "Sir, I need you to step to the back of the vehicle." Walter said, "I understand." He moved to the back of the car. He did not argue. He put his hands where the officer could see them. He had decided when the officer first said, "Step away," that he was going to do exactly what was asked as long as it was reasonable, and he was going to stay calm, and he was going to give the officer every opportunity to see what was plainly in front of him. He had learned this from Margaret. Urgency means you act. Panic means you cannot act. He chose urgency. The officer called for a second unit. Cora climbed down from the back seat. She stood on the pavement. She said, "Papa, what is happening?" Walter said, "It is all right." He said it in the voice he had used for 31 years when a child in his school needed to hear that things were going to be all right even before he knew for certain that they were. The voice did not lie. The voice said, "I am here. I know what I am doing. Stay calm." Cora stood there with the yellow tulips. She was 7 years old, and she was wearing her dance costume under a navy jacket. And she was holding flowers for her teacher, and she was looking at her grandfather over the top of a patrol car. And she did not cry. He saw her decide not to cry. He recognized the moment. He had seen it in children for 31 years. The moment when a child decides that the right response to something frightening is to be steady. Some children find that capacity at 4. Some do not find it until they are 30. Cora found it at 7 in a parking lot on Cedar Street holding yellow tulips. He was proud of her in a way that made him very quiet inside. A second patrol car arrived. A female officer, Officer Dana Kim, got out. She introduced herself to Cora. She said, "My name is Officer Kim. Can you come sit with me for a minute while the officers talk?" Cora looked at Walter. He said, "Go with her. I will be right here." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she went with Officer Kim. She still had the tulips. The first officer. His name was Derek Cole. 27 years old, 5 months on the force, spoke to Walter at the back of the vehicle. He said, "Sir, we need to verify the child's identity and confirm your relationship before we can clear you." Walter said, "I understand. I would like to call my daughter." Cole said, "You can call when we get to the station. Walter said you are detaining me. Cole said we are sorting out the situation. Walter said I have given you my license. I have told you her name. Her parents' name's my name, and the reason we are here. I have offered to give you my daughter's phone number. She can be here in 20 minutes. Cole said, Sir, I need to ask you to turn around. Walter turned. He felt the handcuffs close. He had known this was coming. He had felt the moment when Cole decided. Not when he had looked at the documentation. Before. Cole had decided before the license came out. He had decided in the parking lot when he was still 15 feet away. The documentation had not changed what he had decided. Walter stood at the back of his 2018 Honda, with his hands behind him and the handcuffs on, and he thought about his father, James Sr., in the gray work shirt standing at the large format machine. He thought about the 3 gray shirts. He thought about a man who takes his work seriously, wears a uniform. He thought about Dorothy in the cafeteria feeding other people's children. He thought about Margaret and the crossword puzzles in the waiting room at Riverside General. He thought about the 6 hours and the 11 times he had stood up and sat down and Margaret had not said anything. He thought about Cora in the blanket. He thought about the rearview mirror on a Tuesday morning. Papa. He thought about Roosevelt Elementary. He thought about the front steps in June. He thought about the 4,600 students he had counted out the front door. He thought about Calvin Reese, who had come to Roosevelt in 1997 as a 3rd grader who could not hold a pencil correctly and who Walter had worked with every Tuesday afternoon for an entire school year, driving him home afterward because the bus had already gone. Calvin had not asked to stay for the extra sessions. Walter had not announced them. He had simply said, on the first Tuesday, let us try something, and Calvin had stayed. And the following Tuesday, Calvin had come to Walter's classroom door at 3:15 without being asked. He had stood in the door and said, Is today a Tuesday? Walter had said yes. Calvin had come in. He had stayed every Tuesday for 36 weeks. At the end of the year, he could hold the pencil. He could also read at grade level for the first time. Those 2 things had arrived together. Walter had not planned for that. He had only planned for the pencil. He had written in his notebook that June sometimes the work you see is not the only work you are doing. Calvin was a 3rd grade teacher now in the Millbrook district. He sent Walter a card every Christmas. He had sent one that past December that said, I am doing what you did. I hope I am doing it half as well. Walter had stood at his desk and held that card for a long time. He thought, I know who I am. He thought that does not change in a parking lot. He thought, I know what this is. I have known what this is for 67 years. I have watched it happen to people I love. It has arrived at my turn. My job is to still be here when it is over. He was very still. He was very quiet. He breathed. He thought about the notebook. Not his notebook. Cora's. She had started keeping one the previous October at his suggestion. He had given her a small, 1 blue cover, unlined, and said, Write down what you notice. Not what happens. What you notice. She had looked at the blank first page for 3 days. On the 4th day, she had written the ducks on the east pond come earlier in fall than in spring. She had written the rose at the botanical garden smells like Sunday. She had written when Papa stands still, it means he is deciding something important. He had read that last one on a Sunday when she had left the notebook on the kitchen counter. He had not told her he had read it. He had not known that she watched him the way he watched her. He had been watching children for 31 years and had not noticed that this particular child was watching him back. He had been touched by this in a way that he had not expected. He had put the notebook back on the counter. He had gone into the garden and stood there for a while. He thought she wrote down what I do when I am deciding something important. She has been paying attention. She has been paying attention the way I paid attention. She learned it here. Now he was deciding. He was deciding in handcuffs in the Westfield parking lot on Cedar Street to stay exactly as he was, to not argue, to not raise his voice. to be precise and patient, and to give the officer every piece of evidence that existed, and to wait for the truth to arrive the way it always arrived. Not with announcement, not with drama, but simply by being the only thing that did not go away. He was very still. He was very quiet. He breathed. Officer Kim called Renee at 10:58. Renee answered on the second ring. Kim said, "This is Officer Kim with the Riverside PD. Your daughter Cora is safe. There is a situation involving a man who identifies himself as your father. We need you to come to the Cedar Street Westfield parking lot." Renee said his name is Walter Odom. He is my father. He has Cora every Saturday. I am coming right now. She was there in 19 minutes. She had driven 19 miles per hour over the speed limit. She had left her 4-month-old daughter Lily with her neighbor, Mrs. Greer, who was 73 years old and had already raised 4 children, and did not panic. When Renee came across the parking lot, Cora saw her and said, "Mama." Not a cry, an identification, the same tone she used for Papa. Renee crouched and held Cora for a moment. Then she stood. She looked at Walter across the car. Walter looked at her. He said, "I'm all right." She said, "I know you are." Then she turned to Officer Cole. She was very calm in the way that Margaret was calm. The urgency was there. The panic was not. She said, "My name is Renee Achebe. Walter Odom is my father. Cora is my daughter. He has an authorized pickup arrangement in writing. I have her birth certificate, my ID, and his name on the school emergency contact form. Here." She had brought a folder. She had assembled it in 3 minutes before she left the house. Birth certificate, her own driver's license, Cora's school file printout with the authorized pickup section, 2 photographs, one of Walter and Cora at the library dated printed from her phone, one of Thomas and Walter and Cora at Cora's 3rd birthday party. Cole took the folder. He looked at it. He handed it to Kim. She looked at it. She said something to Cole that Walter could not hear. Cole said, "We still need to follow up at the station." Renee said, "On what basis?" Cole said the original report indicated Renee said the original report was from an anonymous caller. "Are you able to verify the identity of the caller?" Cole was quiet. She said, "Do you have any documentation of the original call beyond the dispatch log?" He said, "Ma'am, we need to follow procedure." She said following procedure would have been reading the documentation my father provided before putting handcuffs on a 67-year-old retired principal. Cole said he would need to consult his supervisor. The supervisor arrived at 11:34, Sergeant William Grady. He reviewed the folder. He looked at Walter. He looked at Cora, who was standing with Renee still holding the tulips. He looked at Cole. He said quietly to Cole, "Walk me through how we got here." Cole walked him through it. Grady listened. He said, "You received an anonymous call." Cole said, "Yes, sir." He said, "And you attempted to verify the caller's identity." Cole said the caller had disconnected. He said, "And after receiving the documentation from Mr. Odom, the license, you determined it was necessary to detain him." Cole said the child's complexion. Grady said the child's complexion. He said it evenly. He did not add anything. He did not need to. Cole was quiet. Grady said the report needs to be filed either way. He looked at Walter. He said, "Mr. Odom." Walter looked at him. He said, "You are not under arrest. I apologize for the circumstances." Walter said, "What is going to happen next?" Grady said the incident report will be reviewed. Cole will file his account. You will be asked to give a formal statement. If there are discrepancies, they will be investigated. He said, "Mr. Odom, I want you to understand that the procedure requires a report even when the situation is resolved." Cole filed a detention notation. That has to go through a magistrate's review. Walter said, "I understand. When is the review?" Grady said, "Monday morning." He said, "You do not need representation if you choose not to have it. But you are welcome to bring your family." Walter said, "I will be there." Renee said, "We will be there." They removed the handcuffs at 11:41. Walter rubbed his wrists. He did not make a show of it. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at Cora. She was looking at him. He said, "Are you ready for the recital?" She said, "Yes." She said, "Papa." He said, "Yes." She said, "I still have the flowers." She held up the tulips. They were slightly bent from being held tightly for 43 minutes, but they were intact. He said, "Ms. Bourne is going to love them." They got in the car. Renee stayed in the parking lot for another 15 minutes to speak with Grady. Walter drove Cora to the Riverside Community Arts Center. They arrived at 1:29. The recital started at 2. There was time. In the car, Cora had been quiet for several minutes. She was looking out the window. Walter drove. He did not push. He had driven many quiet children for 31 years. He knew the difference between quiet that wanted company and quiet that needed room. This was the second kind. After 4 minutes, she said, "Papa." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why did that happen?" He said, "A person thought they saw something they did not see." She said, "What did they think they saw?" He said, "They thought you seemed like you did not want to be with me." She was quiet. She said, "I always want to be with you on Saturdays." He said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't they ask me?" He said, "They should have." She said, "I would have told them." He said, "Yes." She said, "I would have said, 'This is my papa, and we are going to my dance recital, and please stop talking to us.'" He almost smiled. He said, "That would have been very clear." She said, "I have good manners, so I would not have said, 'Please stop talking to us.'" He said, "What would you have said?" She said, "Please talk to someone else." He said, "That is better." She said, "I know. I have very good manners." He said, "Yes. You have extremely good manners." She nodded as if this settled the matter. It did settle the matter. She was 7 years old, and she was entirely correct, and they both knew it. She was quiet again for 2 minutes. Then she said, "Papa." He said, "Yes." She said, "Were you scared?" He said, "No." She thought about this. She said, "What were you?" He said, "I was patient." She said, "What does that mean when you are in handcuffs?" He said, "It means you know what is true and you wait for the other person to find out." She said, "What if they don't find out?" He said, "They always find out. Sometimes it takes longer than it should, but they always find out." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because the truth is the only thing that stays. Everything else changes." She considered this. She was quiet for a while. She was looking at her hands in her lap. He could see her in the rearview mirror. She had her chin slightly down the way she looked when she was thinking carefully about something. He recognized it. He had the same expression. Margaret had told him that once, and he had not believed her until he saw it in Cora. Then he believed it. She looked at the window. She said, "I knew you would be okay." He said, "I know you did." She said, "I kept the flowers." He said, "I saw." They arrived at the Arts Center at 1:29. He sat in the 4th row. Margaret was beside him. He had called her from the car. He had told her what happened. She had been quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to the recital." He said, "There is not much time." She said, "I will be there." She had driven across the city in 22 minutes. She was in the seat beside him when the lights went down. She had not asked him any questions. She had squeezed his hand once when she sat down. He had squeezed back. That was the account. The rest would come later. What mattered now was the 4th row. What mattered now was being present. He watched Cora dance. She was second from the left in the opening sequence, third from the right in the finale. Exactly as she had said. She did not look at the audience during the performance. She looked at the front and at her fellow dancers and at Ms. Bourne, who stood to the side with her hands moving slightly, tracing the counts she had taught them. Walter had spent 31 years watching children do hard things. He had learned that the best ones do not look for reassurance while they are doing the hard thing. They finish. Then they look. Cora finished. Then she looked. She found Walter in the 4th row immediately, the way she always found him. She smiled. He nodded, slowly, the way his father had nodded. I see what you have done, and it is exactly what it should be. Margaret leaned slightly toward him. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. They watched Cora take her bow with the other dancers. Miss Bourne came out and the children surrounded her. Cora presented the tulips. They had survived the morning. They had survived 43 minutes in the grip of a 7-year-old girl who had decided she was going to deliver them. They were still yellow, still standing. Miss Bourne received them with both hands. She looked at Cora. She said something that Walter could not hear from the 4th row. Cora nodded seriously. Walter understood without hearing it what had been said. He understood it the way you understand things that have been true for longer than the moment in which they are said. On Sunday evening, Walter sat at the kitchen table with Renee and Thomas and Margaret. Lily was asleep in the back bedroom. Cora was asleep in the guest room. She had asked to stay the night. She had said, "Can I stay at your house, Papa?" He had said, of course. She had brought her small notebook, the blue one. He had seen her writing in it before she went to sleep. He had not asked what she was writing. The 4 adults sat at the kitchen table and talked about the Monday hearing. Renee had spoken with an attorney, a family law attorney named Patricia Nkosi, who had worked with Margaret professionally for several years. Nkosi said the magistrate review was routine in detention cases and that the documentation was strong. She said, "Bring the child, not as a prop, not as a strategy, because she is the subject of this and it is right for her to be present. And because a 7-year-old walking into a room and identifying her grandfather is not something that requires argument." Renee had said, "That is exactly what I thought," and Cozy had said, "I know." Thomas had been quiet through most of the discussion. He had been quiet all of Saturday afternoon. He had spoken to Walter only once when Walter arrived home from dropping Cora at Renee's apartment. Thomas had been sitting on the front porch. He had stood when Walter's car pulled up. He had looked at Walter. He had said, "I am glad you are here." Walter had said, "I am glad to be here." Thomas had nodded. Then they had gone inside. Thomas was not a man of many words in difficult moments. He was a man who showed up. He had shown up at the parking lot within 40 minutes of the call driving from the other side of the city. He had held Renee's hand in the parking lot. He had held Lily in the crook of his arm while Renee reviewed documents with Grady. He had said nothing that was not necessary. He was the kind of person Walter had learned to recognize over 31 years of watching people work under pressure. The ones who get quiet and get useful, they are the ones you want beside you. Monday morning at 9:15, Walter and Renee and Thomas and Margaret arrived at the magistrate's office on Birch Street. They had brought Cora. Renee had discussed whether to bring her. She had decided yes. Thomas had agreed. Margaret had said bring her. Let the magistrate see what they are looking at. Magistrate Carol Fontaine had been on the bench for 11 years. She had reviewed the incident report Saturday afternoon when it came across her desk. She had read it twice. She had read Grady's addendum, which noted the documentation, the relationship verification, and the anonymous and unverifiable nature of the original complaint. She had also read Cole's original detention report. She had noted the discrepancies in tone between the two documents. She had written 2 questions in the margin. The questions were about the basis for detention and the verification of the original complaint. She had not found answers to those questions in Cole's report. They were shown into the hearing room at 9:22. It was a small room, clean. A long table, chairs on both sides. The magistrate at the head, a clerk to her left. Cole was already there, standing to the right, near the wall. Cora came in holding Margaret's hand. She was in her school clothes, purple shirt jeans, her sneakers with the small embroidered flowers on the side that she had picked herself at the shoe store in January. She was looking at the room. She was 7 years old. She had been told, "We are going to a meeting about what happened Saturday." She had said the thing in the parking lot. Renee had said yes. Cora had said, "Is Papa going to be there?" Renee had said yes. Cora had said, "Then it will be all right." She came in holding Margaret's hand. She looked at the magistrate. She looked at the clerk. She looked at Cole. Then she turned and looked at the table. Walter was sitting at the table. She said, "Papa." She did not run. She was 7 years old, and she understood that the room was serious and that adults in serious rooms moved carefully. She walked. She walked from the doorway across the hearing room floor. She stood beside Walter's chair. She put her right hand on his left arm just above the elbow, the way she always took his arm when they walked somewhere together, and she wanted him to know she was there. She did not say anything else. She stood there. Walter looked at her for 1 second. He put his right hand briefly over hers. Then he looked at the magistrate. The room was very quiet. Magistrate Fontaine looked at Cora. She looked at Walter. She looked at the hand on the arm. She looked at Cole. She looked at her folder. She said, "I have reviewed the incident report." She said, "I have reviewed the documentation provided at the scene and the supplemental documentation provided subsequently." She said the original complaint was anonymous and has not been verified. There is no corroborating evidence. The documentation establishing Mr. Odom's relationship to the child is clear and complete. She said this matter is dismissed. She looked at Cole. She said the review board will be receiving my notes. She said to Walter, "Mr. Odom." He stood. He said yes. She said, "You conducted yourself appropriately throughout. I am sorry for the circumstances." He said, "Thank you." He looked at Cora, who was still standing beside him with her hand on his arm. He said, "All right, little one, let's go." She said, "Okay, Papa." They walked out together. Renee filed a formal written complaint with the department that afternoon. She had been drafting it since 11 o'clock that morning on her phone while waiting in the Westfield parking lot, and then while waiting at the station. She had been drafting it in her head since 10:59:30 after Officer Kim called her. She submitted it with the full documentation folder, the timeline she had constructed from her phone log, the birth certificate, and the parking lot security camera footage, which she had requested from Westfield Grocery, and which the store manager, a woman named Sandra Holloway, had provided without hesitation. Sandra had watched the footage before providing it. She had pulled it up on her office screen. She had watched Walter unstrapping Cora from her car seat. She had watched them walk across the lot, holding hands. She had watched Cora holding the tulips up to show Walter something as they walked. She had watched them come back to the car. She had watched everything. She had said to Renee, "I am very sorry this happened. I have had my own Saturdays." She did not say anything more about this. She did not need to. Renee had understood. She had put the drive in her folder and thanked her and left. 2 former students from Roosevelt Elementary came forward in the week following the incident. They had read the brief item that ran in the Tribune on Thursday, 8 column inches on page 4, factual and restrained. The first was a woman named Kendra Marshall, who had been in Walter's 4th year of teaching. She had been in his 4th grade class in 1993. She was now 41 years old and ran a pediatric speech therapy practice on the North Side. She wrote to the department's community affairs office. She said, "I want to give you a reference for Walter James Odom." She said he drove me home every Tuesday for an entire school year because the tutoring session ran past the bus. He did not tell my mother why he was driving me. He just drove me. She said, "I am a therapist now because a teacher stayed. That teacher was Walter Odom. I would like that on the record." The second was Calvin Reese. He sent a letter by email to the department, to the magistrate's office, and to the Tribune. He said, "My name is Calvin Reese. I am a 3rd grade teacher in the Millbrook district. I have been a teacher for 11 years. I became a teacher because Walter James Odom spent 1 academic year working with me every Tuesday afternoon when I was 8 years old and could not hold a pencil correctly. He said Mr. Odom is a man of extraordinary patience and character. He said whatever he did in that parking lot on Saturday, I can tell you exactly what it looked like. It looked like a man standing still. It looks like that because that is what he does. He stands still and he waits for the truth to arrive. He has been doing it for 67 years. He said, "I want this on the record. The formal review of Officer Cole's conduct began 11 days after the incident. The review board examined three things: the original detention report, Grady's addendum, and the security camera footage from the Westfield parking lot. The footage showed Walter unstrapping Cora from her car seat, both of them walking across the lot, holding hands, both of them returning to the car, holding flowers, and the 3 minutes of interaction before Cole arrived, during which Cora was visibly calm, talking and pointing at the flowers. There was no distress. There had been no distress before the officer arrived. The board also reviewed the 2 letters from former students. They were not required documentation. They were submitted voluntarily. The review board read them. They were entered into the file. The board also reviewed Cole's prior history. There were 2 prior complaints in his 5-month file. Both had been reviewed at the supervisory level. Neither had resulted in formal documentation. After review of all 3 incidents together, the board determined a pattern existed. Officer Cole received a formal written reprimand. He was required to complete 12 hours of training in de-escalation procedures and complaint verification protocols. He was placed on a 30-day supervised patrol assignment. The department also issued a new standing procedure for anonymous child welfare calls. Responding officers were required to conduct a verbal assessment of the child and the accompanying adult and document their observations before initiating physical separation or detention of the adult. The procedure named 2 specific items that must be recorded: whether the child appeared to know the adult and whether the adult's account was corroborated by any documentation or verifiable information before escalation. Sergeant Grady presented the procedure at the monthly precinct meeting. He said, "This is how we protect the public and ourselves." He did not mention the Odom case by name. He did not need to. Everyone in the room had read the report. Ms. Patricia Bourne called Walter on Monday evening. She said, "Cora told me what happened. She said, 'I want you to know that I saved her a program. All the other girls signed it.' Walter said, 'That is very kind.' She said, 'I also want to tell you I have a summer showcase in July. I would like to give Cora a solo, not because of what happened, because she has earned it. She has been the most prepared student in my class for 7 months. She deserves a solo.' Walter said, 'I will tell Renee.' She said, 'Please tell her it is my honor.'" The summer showcase was on the 14th of July. It was a Saturday. Walter picked Cora up at 9. They went to the park. The ducks were on the east pond. Howard, Patricia, and Clarence Cora checked. She said all 3 names, she said, and 1 new one. She pointed to a 4th duck near the bank. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Dorothy." Walter said, "Dorothy." She said, "Yes." Walter did not say anything else. Dorothy had been his mother's name. He did not know if Cora knew that. He did not ask. Some things you hold. You do not examine them. You let them be what they are. Then they went to the Community Arts Center. Walter sat in the front row. Margaret was beside him. Thomas was on the aisle. Renee was in the second row with Lily, who was now 6 months old. Lily was looking at the stage lights with complete focused attention, the way very young children look at lights as if the light itself were trying to communicate something, and she was working to understand it. Renee had her arm around her. Ms. Bourne came out before the showcase began and spoke briefly to the parents. She said these children have worked very hard this spring and summer. She said, "I want you to understand what you are watching. You are watching children who have learned that difficulty is not the same as failure. You are watching what happens when you keep going." She said the solos tonight are earned, every one of them. Then she went to the side of the stage. The lights went down. Cora performed her solo in the 4th slot of the program. It was a piece Ms. Bourne had choreographed to a piano piece that Walter did not know the name of, but recognized immediately the way it moved, and stopped, moved, and stopped. The pauses as deliberate as the motion. Like breathing. Like the way a person speaks when they have something important to say and are not afraid to let the silence hold the weight between the words. She had practiced this for 61 days since Ms. Bourne had assigned it to her. Walter knew because Cora had counted. She kept the count in her blue notebook. She had written the number each day after practice. He had seen the notebook. On the inside cover, she had written 61 times and counting. Below that, in a different pen, the blue one she used for important things she had written. I am keeping the count because Papa taught me that the work has weight. He had not known she was watching when he talked about that. He had been talking to Renee. Cora had been in the next room. She had been paying attention. That was what she did. She performed the piece completely. She did not look at the audience during the performance. She looked where the piece required her to look forward, then left, then down in the turn, then up at the end. When the last note of the piano faded, she held the final position for 4 full counts. Ms. Bourne had taught her that. The last position is the last word. You do not end it before it is finished. Then she was done. She looked at the front row. She found Walter immediately, the way she always found him. Not because he was the largest or the loudest or the closest, because she had been looking for him since she was 2 years and 4 months old, and she knew exactly where he was. She smiled. He nodded, once, slowly, the whole weight of it in one nod. Margaret put her hand on his arm. He did not look away from the stage. He kept nodding. Walter had driven Beaufort Street on the way home from the Westfield parking lot that Saturday. Not deliberately. It was not his usual route. He had turned onto it without thinking. He had driven it slowly. He had thought, I know this street. I have always known this street. My father knew this street. Every black man in this city knows this street. The street that goes on and requires nothing of you but to keep driving. He had kept driving. He had arrived home. He had put the car in the garage. He had gone inside and sat at the kitchen table. Margaret had come and sat across from him. She had not said anything for a few minutes. Then she said, What are you thinking about? He said, I am thinking about the tulips. She said, Tell me. He said she held on to those flowers for 43 minutes. While all of it was happening, she never put them down. She never dropped them. She held those flowers for Ms. Bourne. Margaret said, Of course she did. She said she knew it was going to be all right. She said she has watched you know it for 7 years. She learned it from you. Walter said I learned it from my mother. Margaret said, and she learned it from someone. And on back. He said, yes. She said that's the whole thing. It goes back. Then it goes forward. You are the middle. She said Cora is the forward. He sat with that. He put his hands on the table. He breathed. He thought about the moment in the parking lot when Cora had climbed down from the back seat with the tulips and looked at him across the roof of the car and decided not to cry. He thought about what it meant that she had made that decision. He thought about all the decisions he had made in 67 years that had led to a 7-year-old girl in a parking lot knowing without being told what to do with fear when it arrived, not to disappear it, not to pretend it was not there, to hold it and keep holding the tulips and look at the person you trust and wait. The truth will arrive. Your job is to still be here when it gets there. He wrote it down. He got out the notebook he had kept for 23 years as principal. A new one, same format, same size, brown cover, and he wrote what had happened. All of it. The time. The parking lot. Cora's name. Cole's name. The handcuffs. The documents Renee brought. Grady's words. The magistrate's words. Cora's hand on his arm. He wrote, she said, Papa. He wrote, she walked across the room. She stood beside me. She put her hand on my arm. She did not explain. She did not need to explain. That is the word she chose when she was 2 years and 4 months old. She has chosen it every Saturday since. She chose it in that room. He closed the notebook. He put it on the shelf beside the one from his years as principal. 47 notebooks on that shelf. The count was in all of them. The weight of what had passed through was in all of them. He stood in front of the shelf for a moment. He looked at the notebooks. He had kept the count of children for 23 years. He had written what he did wrong. He had written what he would do differently. He had written the names of students he was watching. He had written Calvin Reese, 3rd grade, Tuesday afternoons needs to build grip strength first. He had written Kendra Marshall, 4th grade, she already knows, she just needs someone to know that she knows. He had written in a notebook from 2003, there will be a child you do not reach. Not because you failed, but because not every reaching succeeds in the moment. You plant, you go back, you do it again. The work is not a moment. It is a practice. He had written in the summer of 2018 when he retired. I leave this school today with 46 notebooks and 4,600 names, and a belief I have held since my mother stood behind a cafeteria counter and looked at other people's children. Every single one of them is the most important thing in some person's life. That has always been enough to keep working. That will always be enough. Now there was a 47th notebook. The shelf was one longer. He had written the name Derek Cole in it. He had written the name of the anonymous caller unknown and marked it unknown because accuracy required marking what you did not know as clearly as what you did. He had written Sergeant Grady. He had written Magistrate Fontaine. He had written Kendra Marshall's letter and Calvin Reese's letter. He had written Sandra Holloway's words, I have had my own Saturdays. He had written every word of it the way James Sr. had worn his gray shirt. A man who takes his work seriously wears a uniform. The notebook was his uniform. It said, I am here for this. I am not here for anything else. He went to make tea. Margaret came in. She sat at the kitchen table. He made 2 cups. He brought them over. He sat down. Outside on Carver Street, it was evening. The light was going the way light goes in April, slowly, with colors, with the particular quality of ending that spring evenings have, where you can feel both the winter that just left and the summer that is coming. The dogwood tree in the front yard had bloomed that week. Dorothy had planted it the year Walter was born. She had planted it in March before he arrived. She had said, according to James Sr., that she wanted it to be growing already when the child came. She wanted the child to come into a world where something was already rooted. It was 67 years old and still blooming. He looked at it through the kitchen window. He thought about his mother. He thought about her crossword puzzles at the kitchen table. He thought about feeding other people's children for 22 years and what she had learned from it and what she had given him from what she learned. He thought the dogwood is still here. He thought that is the answer to most of the questions that seemed unanswerable today. He picked up his cup. Margaret picked up hers. He said next Saturday. She said yes. He said we'll go back to the pond, see if the ducks are there. She said she named a new one. He said Dorothy. Margaret was quiet. She looked at him. He said she named it Dorothy. She did not say she did not know why. Margaret said no. She said she knows. She is 7. They know more than we think. He said yes. He said she chooses well. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then they drank their tea in the kitchen on Carver Street while the last of the April light went out the window and the week came in, and on the shelf in the next room, 47 notebooks held the names of 4,600 children who had passed through his front door, and the newest notebook held one April Saturday in its pages written in a steady hand that had held a pen steadily through 67 years of whatever arrived. Papa. She walked across the room. She put her hand on his arm. She was 7 years old, and she knew exactly who he was. She had known since she was 2 years and 4 months old. He had made sure she would always have reason to know. One Saturday at a time. One duck pond at a time. One bunch of yellow tulips at a time. One truth at a time kept in the notebook, counted, signed, and shelved because the record belongs to the one who keeps it. And Walter James Odom had always kept the record. Subscribe our channel. We find the record and we read what it says. One Saturday at a time. One duck pond at a time. One bunch of yellow tulips at a time. Subscribe our channel. We find the record and we read what it says.